Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for jumping on. So this morning's live, we will be discussing Dr. Rusty's research in the AMH field. So Dr. Rusty, I'll just dive straight into my first question, which is, could you just please tell us about your research on AMH variability?
Yes, thank you. So there has been so much confusion about AMH test. As a result, it has not been utilized properly. So, and this is why we need to dig deep into the AMH. So we need to understand properties of AMH as a molecule and properties of AMH test. And hence we are doing analysis of different published research studies, so including our own research. So, and the during next 5-6 live streams, we will be discussing research studies I conducted with our group in Manchester University in UK. So it will shed some light on properties of AMH and AMH test and application of AMH test. So today we'll be discussing our first research study, which was published in fertility and sterility in back 2010. So, and that research was led by me and supervised by Dr. Nardo and supported by a group of scientists and clinicians at Manchester University and St. Mary's Hospital in Manchester. So we conducted this research in 2010. It was first published in 2010, then in paper form it was published in 2011 in fertility sterility. So the purpose of that research was to understand the variability or fluctuation of AMH test results. So first AMH test was applied in clinical practice in 2006. So St. Mary's Hospital in Manchester was one of the first clinics which introduced AMH test, and we had a good amount of data by 2009, 2010 on patients who did AMH test as a part of their fertility workup in IVF. So at the time, we didn't know how much of variation you see in AMH test results. That was important because we were using AMH tests in IVF for two purposes. First, to establish who actually should not have IVF. If they had a very low AMH levels, we did not offer IVF treatment because IVF was offered as part of NHS funding at St. Mary's Hospital. We felt if AMH level was too low, patients should not be offered IVF treatment because chance of successful pregnancy is so low, and it may be frustrating for the patients to undergo IVF without having good chance of success, and it may not be optimal use of NHS funds. So this was one purpose of using AMH test, and second purpose of using AMH test at the time was to determine which ovarian stimulation protocol should be used. So we categorized patients into multiple different categories depending on their AMH levels. Then we decided what dose of FSH drug should be used. Let us say in a high AMH level where you give a low dose of FSH, and low AMH level we give a high dose of FSH to optimize. Optimization means to get sufficient good number of eggs without causing under response or over response. So that's why AMH was a main tool to determine who should not have IVF and what dose of FSH was used. We wanted to find out if actually AMH fluctuates. If AMH does not fluctuate, then you can do one single AMH test, and on the basis of that, you can make these two critical decisions, which means deny IVF treatment to some patients because AMH is so reliable and we can actually tell this patient's likelihood of success is so low, and we can say you're not going to have IVF under NHS funding, or we determine which dose of stimulation should be given, whether you should have a FSH of 150 units or 225 units. So this was a purpose at the time. I was a clinical fellow. I had just joined St. Mary's Hospital, Manchester, in Manchester University as a clinical research fellow during my training as an obstetrician and gynecologist in Manchester. So the research was led by Dr. Nardo who's the expert in result in AMH test and anti-follicle count test, and then we conducted the research in conjunction with scientists who actually do analysis of AMH, biomedical science, who actually analyzed our AMH test. This is why we had input from different groups of clinicians, and actually the research was co-supervised by best statistician in the field of IVF reproductive medicine called Steve Roberts. So so we're quite confident on reliability of our data. Of course, no research study is perfect, and we need to understand limitations of the research studies after reading the methodologies. So this research is published in Fertility Sterility, and it's available freely online. You can just type Dr. Rustamov AMH reproducibility, fertility sterility on Google. It will come up and you can actually read. So very importantly, when we analyze research studies, the first thing you need to look at is the methodology of the research. So all these limitations of research, published research, is confined by its methodology. So, and this is why understanding methodology important to decide whether you actually believe in these research studies or not. So essentially what we did is back in 2010, we established all women who had a repeated AMH test. At the time, we were repeating AMH every 6 months to get more up-to-date AMH result before we decide which protocol we should use for each patient. So, and we've identified in 2010, there were 186 patients who had a repeated AMH test, and we included all these patients. When you do research study, it's important to include all patients. So you should not actually select the patients. You should, let us say, you put the time period from this date to that date, and whoever had a repeat AMH, you should include, you should not exclude. So we include all patients who had AMH test on our data set. We found that 186 patients had a repeated AMH test. So, and so samples who actually hemolyzed were removed, and then we had a 373 repeated samples of AMH. So 186 patients had a repeated. Total number of AMH measurement was 373, which means most patients had the AMH twice, and some patients had AMH 3 times. So we wanted to check what's actually the difference between AMH levels of the same patient who had it twice. So if you have a very little variability, when you repeat the test, you get very similar result. If you have a huge variability, you have a different results. So that's what we wanted to establish. So, and so average repeat duration of repeated tests was 2.5 months, so almost 3 months. So then we checked what's actual difference between the test results. We found so difference between the repeated test results were 28%. So its coefficients of variation was 28%. So which means, for example, I'll give you example what it means. So let us say someone had an AMH of 10. So then when they repeat the AMH test after 2.5 months, you can expect their difference in the level will be 30%, almost 28%. So maybe it comes back as a 13 next time, or it may come back as a 7. Yeah, so this is very appreciable variation. We cannot ignore. So which means when we do AMH, we should assume actual AMH level will be hovering or fluctuating around 30% of reported value. So which means we should not take AMH result as absolute number. So later on, we tried to establish what could be the source of variation, and we think it's coming from natural fluctuation. Yeah, so on the basis of this research, we then reported AMH can vary 28% in average. When you're making clinical decisions, you need to take this into account. So let us say if you are excluding any patient from IVF treatment, you need to understand actually this value you have got is not absolute. You may need to repeat again once or twice to have an actual proper reading. So let us say if you do twice or 3 times, you add an average out. Let us say you do twice, you add 10 plus 12 and divided by 2, so it's approximately 11. So that's probably more accurate. So yeah, so that's what we reported at the time back in 2010.
Thank you, Dr. Rusty. And this variability you are mentioning, what is the implication of it in use of AMH in IVF?
Yeah, so the first of all, we will try to understand where this variation is coming from. So the variation can come naturally or biologically, or it can come from measurement. For example, you are measuring the variation of weather, yeah, temperature, yeah, outside. So you measured one day it's 20 degrees, next day 25 degrees, next day 23 degrees. So you actually, the actual temperature outside in nature may be changing, or your measurement may be faulty. Your thermometer may be giving you a wrong measurement. So this is why question is actually when anything fluctuates or varies, whether this variation is coming biologically or naturally, or it's coming from the measurement. So this is why we want to know whether actually AMH naturally in women varies, or whether actually our test, AMH test, is not perfect. It shows different result every time you measure. So we at the time also in now we think that's actually biggest part of variation comes from natural variation of AMH. So, and why? Because when we take AMH sample, you measure the sample and in 2 allocates. You separate same sample. Yeah, let us say you took the sample today, you separate it to 2 and measure twice. And this is called inter-assay variation, was less than 5%. In this published research study, in our study, inter-assay variation was less than 5%. We think, yes, measurement probably relative variation maybe 5%, but most of this is coming due to natural variation, because there is a difference between AMH in these women between 2 samples in average 2.6 months apart. So naturally AMH can go up and down approximately maybe 20-25%. That makes sense. Later this week or next week we'll publish another research study which we published which measures a variation of AFC as well. That's AFC and AMH is linked, because AMH is produced from antral follicles and AFC also varies 30%. So which means very likely actually number of follicles on ovaries vary approximately 28-30%. And the level of AMH these follicles produce vary also approximately 28-30%. That's a very important thing to understand, because when you're doing IVF treatment, for example, so you can see this natural variation. Let us say you did IVF, once you had 10 follicles. So next time, because of natural variation, you can have 13-14 follicles, and next time you can have 6 follicles. So that's very important. So let us say if you had a very low number of follicles, you had a poor outcome in IVF, by chance next time you may have more follicles, especially if your IVF protocol is optimized, you may get much better result. So, but when we say variation 30%, that's average variation, which means in some patients this variation may be huge, maybe 70%, or even higher in outliers. So that we need to take into account. So understanding that actually number of follicles you have on your ovaries can fluctuate by 30% is very important for you and for your doctors, fertility specialists, to understand how your ovaries work and analyze your IVF cycle and make a plan for future IVF cycle. Yes, variation we think is mainly coming from natural variation. Yes, there's about 5% variation coming from the test itself. So implication of this variation is, like we said in IVF, is when, like we said before, in the past, we thought patients with very low, critically low AMH should not have IVF treatment, especially if it's publicly funded, because we thought the chance of successful pregnancy is so low. So, and we, at the time when we published this research back in 2010, we made a recommendation saying, look, do not use AMH as a sole test to determine who should not have IVF, because it can vary, it can give a wrong result, then as a result you may deny some women of IVF treatment, in publicly funded IVF treatment. As a result, they may not be able to have a child. So we made the recommendation, so look, take everything else into account and not only AMH. So, and now we know, of course, a lot of women with very low egg reserve, very low AMH can have successful pregnancy naturally, or by doing another fertility treatment, or by doing IVF. But at the time, in 2010, our understanding of egg reserve was much poorer. So, and so this research paper contributed towards that. And the second reason, second implication of this research in IVF is, when at the time we had a very strict cutoff levels of egg reserve, because we didn't think that egg reserve varies or AMH varies. So let us say we had AMH, if your AMH is 2.2, you had FSH of 450. If your AMH is, let us say, 3.0, you had FSH of 300. We said, yes, you can have a cutoff ranges, but it should be much wider because of variation. Same patient, if she did a test today, you would give her a FSH of 450. And if she had a test after 2 months, you would have given a FSH of 300. So this is why you can have a cutoff ranges if you do use the protocols in your clinic, stratification protocols in your clinic, but this cutoff range should be wider, not very narrow. So yeah, so these two implications were there for IVF research, IVF practice.
Thank you, Dr. Asti. My final question is, some say that you can improve your AMH. Are they just seeing the variability?
Yes, very good question. So a lot of people can report online on social media themselves, or a lot of scientists can report online or on the journals various intervention like diet, maybe, I don't know, even medications, DHEA, testosterone, all these medications, and they say, okay, we improved our AMH levels. No, actually, they are seeing natural variation. Let us say, for example, you did AMH and you took a vitamin, or maybe like sugar pill. Yeah, so then after 3 months, you checked your AMH. It can be a little bit higher or maybe a little bit lower. Not because you're taking sugar pill, it's because naturally it's going up and down. So a lot of research studies which claimed they improved egg reserve or AMH after using various interventions, actually they measured natural variation and reported as an increase in egg reserve and AMH. Generally, you cannot increase egg reserve. Generally egg reserve goes down over time before it hits zero, but naturally it can go up and down. And if you measure in different points, you may think that it's increasing, it's reducing, but it's natural variation. We know we will be discussing in the future when we discuss IVF, in certain circumstances, actually, you can improve the recruitment of follicles. So, and as a course of IVF treatment, temporarily follicle number can go up. Maybe your IMH can go up higher because it's coming from recruited follicles, but that's a rare. So, yes, overall, when some patients, some women say, oh, I did some diet or whatever, my AMH went up, it's not because of what they're doing, it's because of natural variation. And one more thing we need to discuss, Gabi, about this variation is why this understanding AMH variation is important, is that especially for long-term prediction of AMH. Like we said before, AMH can be used for fertility treatment or management or IVF, but also AMH can be used to establish your egg reserve or baseline egg reserve and monitor your egg reserve. So for long-term prediction, let us say you did AMH at the age of 25, your AMH came back as 10, and on the basis of this, you want to know how long your egg reserve will be lasting. So, and the approximate decline of AMH, even in this our published research, is 5 to 10%. So some research studies publishing like 10% AMH declines per year. In this our research, we published like 5% AMH decline per year. So let us say 10% means if your AMH is 10, you estimate 1 picomole of AMH will drop per year, and you have approximately 10 years of functional egg reserve. Let us say your age of 25, and at the age of 35, you have very low AMH. Then gradually you will have an undetectable AMH, then gradually you go into perimenopause. So if it's 5% decline, it's less. Actually, you can have a longer duration of your egg reserve. So understanding variability is important, especially for long-term prediction. For example, let us say you did one AMH measurement at the age of 25, it was 10. So if you repeat it again, so next time after 3 months, it may be, let us say, 13. So if you believe on 10, so after like 10 years prediction, so you would assume it will run out of 10 years or so. If you believed on 13, it can run out in about 13, 14, 15 years. So like 3-4 years difference in long-term prediction. So this is why you need to measure twice and then divide into 2, then get average measurement. Like we said, it's impossible to tell for each patient exact year when they completely run out of egg reserve. And when they start having perimenopause, when they start having menopause, because there's individual variation, but we can give overall picture of prediction. So according to different research studies, 5 to 10%, which most likely it's 0.5 picomoliters picomoliters per year in average. So it may be little more, little less. So yes, so this is why understanding variation is important. And there's nothing in this nature or biology, human body is static. Everything varies. Your temperature, your blood pressure, your heart rate, sugar levels, all parameters, all hormones, including AMH, varies little bit. And it's important to know how much it naturally varies. Now we know that your egg reserve and AMH test, antral follicle count, varies approximately 25 to 30%.
Thank you, Dr. Asti. That was really interesting hearing about your part 1 of your research, especially on AMH variability. That does conclude our live stream this morning, so thank you so much to those that joined. As always, the recording of this live will be published on Dr. Asti's social media channels on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. We will resume live streams tomorrow, where we will continue discussing Dr. Asti's research in AMH. Thank you, Dr. Asti.
Thanks, Gabby. Thanks, everyone, for joining the live stream. Thank you. Thanks.